You're listening to Wycombe Sound's election special with myself, Bob Johnson. We have heard already this evening from Tony Brodel, who is standing for the Liberal Democrats in the Wycombe constituency. Next up, it is the turn of the Conservative candidate, Steve Baker. And I started by asking Steve to tell us a little bit more about himself.
I was born in St Austell in Cornwall. My parents came from Aldershot and they decided to settle in St Austell. And beautiful place to be down there in Cornwall. Went to Poltaire Comprehensive, so absolutely delighted to represent an area with such a diverse range of schools, but I went to a comprehensive. Went to Southampton University on a cadetship with the Royal Air Force, had a sixth form scholarship, then a cadetship, became an engineer.
Okay, and career-wise, while you were an engineer?
Yeah, so I was a Royal Air Force engineer officer on fast jets, first with components on a Tornado base, then engineering officer on a Jaguar squadron, 41 squadron, and then I was the engineering authority for the Adur gas turbine. The dot-com boom was happening, and I decided I wanted to be part of it, rather than working always on aero engines for the rest of my career, which, though brilliant, wasn't where my heart was. So I left the Air Force, took an MSc in computer science at Oxford, and went on into various startups and freelance work and so forth, ending up working at regulators and banks and seeing the financial crisis unfolding at first hand.
When did the interest in politics start? Was it way back, or was it more recently?
It was very, very, very late. So two things sort of happened together. I was at Lehman Brothers when the financial crisis happened, and that fed into my interest in the boom-bust cycle, because of course when I did my master's degree in 2000, the dot-com bubble burst, and I'd started reading about why the boom-bust cycle happened. So that was one factor. The other was that the Constitution for Europe was rammed through without a referendum by calling it the Lisbon Treaty and restructuring it, but with substantially the same material. They changed the Constitution of France to avoid having a referendum and got the Irish to vote twice. And they did all this because the Constitution for Europe had been rejected twice in referenda, so they stopped having them. And at this point, I just sat back and I thought, what is going on? I'd read the Constitution and I didn't like it very much, too bureaucratic, and I thought, well, that's okay because I'll vote against it in the referendum, which they cancelled. But when I realised that the elite running Europe just evidently didn't care how we voted, I thought, well, I'm not having that. I'm just not having that. And I thought, what can I do? Emigrate, moan or stand? I decided I would stand in 2007, and the rest is now history. So I'm very grateful that my wife and I were living at Walter's Ash for a couple of years while she served at Air Command. She was due to leave the Air Force in 2010. Paul Goodman decided to stand down, and things all came together serendipitously because the Chilterns was where my wife and I wanted to live anyway, so we're now very happily settled in West Wycombe. And of course I've been the MP for 9 years.
Well, when you look back to 2007, did you have any inkling of what was going to happen? Did you imagine that you would get...
It's been the most extraordinary journey on a personal level, an extraordinary privilege. The lives that I've been involved with, I could never have foreseen the depth and range of involvement that I would need to have with people. I mean, from going to a psychiatrist's appointment with someone to discussing people's tax affairs, immigration benefits, housing, with rich and poor across all sections of our community. I mean, I've preached the gospel in a mosque and on Palm Sunday 2015, and it was well received. I never expected that being an MP would involve preaching the gospel in a mosque. So it's been the most extraordinary journey, and everything, of course, with relating to the EU, I could never have forecast. I mean, I once had a young woman on the street in London approach me to say, "Hello, Mr. Baker, I've been studying you at university." She'd been reading one of Tim Shipman's books in her university course, so in which I have my own chapter. So it's been a really extraordinary journey. I'm very, very grateful to the voters of Wycombe for letting me have this opportunity to serve them in this way.
And then most recently, you were talked about as being a potential leadership candidate in the contest.
Yeah, well, it's very humbling. So I had no leadership contest. I've never declared an interest in being Prime Minister, and yet members of the Conservative Party put me in the top 5 twice in polls for Conservative Home. And in fact, on the second time, I went from 4th to 5th, but that was because people had converged on Rory Stewart, so my vote share went up a little bit, but I was still 5th. But that's very humbling, makes you think seriously, and it's obviously resulted in many, many more people recognising me. Obviously, I have to think very carefully about it, but it wasn't a credible proposition last time. To go from, I had a very wide-ranging role when I was in government for a year. I put through probably the most important and complex piece of constitutional legislation, at least in our lifetimes, and I put it through Parliament as my first bill. And for domestic preparedness for leaving the EU, I worked right across all government departments, including chairing committees with secretaries of state before the committee within government. So it's a pretty good year's experience, but it's hard to see how you go from 1 year's experience as a parliamentary undersecretary to Prime Minister. And so there was no way I would have got through the first round. But I was very, very humbled by all the support that I had. Yeah.
When Boris then became Prime Minister, you then turned down a role with him. There's a lot of ifs coming in this question, but if you get back in, and if Boris then does form the next government and he offers you a role, would you be tempted?
Well, there are a lot of ifs. I resigned from government on principle, along with Boris and David Davis. I then turned down not one but 2 jobs because Boris offered me a second job that I don't want to discuss because it would undermine the person who has it. And they were both jobs in normal circumstances you'd do cartwheels to accept. The second one in particular is a very good job. But I did it because I thought I could best serve my colleagues in the country by chairing the ERG, frankly, because chairing the ERG has allowed me to, I hope my colleagues won't mind me saying it, but it's allowed me to get to a position where all my colleagues voted for a deal. And if I hadn't done what I've done, which I know many people locally have not liked, but if I hadn't done what I'd done, we wouldn't be in a position where we've got a deal with which we can leave the EU, and the Conservative Party in Parliament has united around it. Because if we'd gone on with Theresa May's deal, and if I and all the other Eurosceptics had voted for it, it still would have failed in Parliament. That's the way the arithmetic is. So that deal was clearly untenable. It had to change. And I don't think there's any point denying that I've been central to getting that deal changed, getting Boris in as Prime Minister, and getting the party to unite behind Boris and that deal. So that's why I turned down the job. I thought, as I said publicly at the time, I thought that being in DEXU was a pointless thing to do. I mean, it's the negotiations run by Number 10, not by DEXU. So for all of the reasons that I've given and that new one, that I thought I could do more good helping my colleagues to vote for a revised deal. It's tough selling it to concerned Remain Conservatives who don't like the way I've been portrayed in the media, but I have to say to them, I've compromised, and I recognise they voted Remain. I do, and I recognise they still don't want to leave. But all sides have compromised in order that we can honour the referendum result. And I really hope people will understand that what I've done is try to serve the public good by getting to the point we have a deal which can lead to a great future. Not a poor future, a great future as an independent country outside the EU's legal order, broad and deep. I can go through it at length if you like. But I'm excited about the future that's possible, but we can only do it with a Conservative majority.
What will Wycombe look like?
I've realised I haven't answered your question. Would I accept a job?
Oh.
Boris and I haven't discussed whether or not I'm going to be offered another job in government. But it's not normal to refuse a job in government if you're offered, but we haven't discussed it.
I can tell you've done this before because you're picking me up on the questions that I've asked. So
Sorry,
no, not at all. I'm very impressed.
The last thing I want is for your listeners to be saying you didn't answer.
He didn't answer that question, and then Bob didn't pick him up on it, which is even worse. So, with regards to Brexit, what will Wycombe look like once we have left
Wycombe
the EU?
will look very much like it does today. There is no appetite anywhere in the country for some devastating, dramatic shift, which is what my opponents and the opponents of Brexit suggest. What will happen is that we'll agree a wide-ranging free trade agreement, all sectors, no tariffs, no quantitative restrictions, including services. That's what they want, and that's what both sides are bound to negotiate in good faith by the withdrawal agreement. There'll be defence and security cooperation, participation in research and innovation, education and culture. It's a really broad and deep relationship, but outside the legal structure of the EU and outside the political objective of ever closer union. So it really delivers on the referendum result, and I'm confident if we negotiate well, we'll be able to get a relationship which objectively will satisfy most people. There'll always be someone who thinks we should never have left. There'll always be someone who thinks this isn't a Brexit that's hard enough. But I think that objectively the majority of the country will be able to unite and say, hey, you know what? We've left the EU, but we're still travelling to the EU. Our children are still going on trips to European universities or studying there or whatever. And we should as a country be capable of being happy and settled with our relationship, and then over time they will they will go one way and we perhaps will go another, but it will be on detail, like how the regulation of the insurance industry works. So Solvency II doesn't really work for the UK insurance industry. It's something the Treasury Committee that I've sat on inquired into. The industry complained about it but had to implement it. Well, in the future, we'll be able to have outcome-based equivalents. In other words, we're still a high standards nation. We're still making sure that we regulate our industries well, but we do it in a way which satisfies us and is equivalent in outcome to the way the EU does it, but that we don't have to adopt all their methods. And that, I think, is really, really important to human progress. Human progress comes through trial and error. Everybody likes to believe they can come up with the right answer in advance and then get everything to run perfectly, but that's just not what happens, and any entrepreneur would know that. So it's really important that we can try different ways of achieving the same outcomes in right across the world, and yet continue free trade. So I think that Wycombe will settle down as most people come to see through experience that we are a moderate government. If we win a majority, that we're a moderate government, that we've served the public good by maintaining a broad and deep relationship with our European friends, and that we can just settle down and get on to normal stuff.
When you're canvassing on the doorsteps, is Brexit the main thing that people are speaking to you about, or is there a bigger issue in Wycombe at the moment?
I think in this general election we've canvassed a lot as a Conservative Party. In this election it has mostly been Brexit, but as usual when you knock on doors, most people are out. A proportion of people really don't want to talk to you.
Particularly in November and December, I would imagine.
And you can feel the heat pouring out of people's houses. So most people don't want us on the doorstep for long conversations. But I am aware that votes are shifting around. There are Conservative voters who have not enjoyed watching me on the TV, and I've appealed to them already. There are Labour voters who don't want Jeremy Corbyn. There are Liberal voters who don't want the Liberal policy of revoke or second referendum, which seems to have changed recently. But, so I think votes are going to shift around, and this is going to make for a very interesting election right across the whole country. But in the end, I'm a Democrat. I've done what I've done. I've had a mandate for what I've done in the manifestos and my publicly expressed views. People should, had opportunity to know for what I stood, because it was in the manifestos and so on. So I've done what I've done, and people, of course, will now judge me, and that's the way that politics in a democracy works. And it is a sometimes scary and sometimes honouring process.
One of the things that's come up a lot in the questions that people sent to us was regarding the NHS and also Wycombe Hospital. You've been quite vocal in the past month at least, talking about Wycombe Hospital, and over the last 9 years. Yes, absolutely. But definitely, since the election's called, I know that you've had Matt Hancock come down here.
Yeah.
Why is that, and how do you feel about Wycombe Hospital at the moment?
So the reason I got into politics was to try and do it the way I thought it ought to be done, which was with due regard to what the public really thought, remembering the reason I got into it was because I thought that politicians had stopped caring how we voted. So I've always made the NHS my top priority in Wycombe, because it's the public's top priority. But also I think we've got to be honest with people. So I think if we went back to my 2010 literature, which I haven't dug it out yet, but I'm pretty sure what I promised to do was leave no stone unturned in the search to see if we could get A&E back, and that's what I did. I went off, as I said in the panel discussion, and talked to the very top people. And the truth is that since our hospital was designed to have an A&E, medicine's dramatically advanced, and we're far more likely to live if we have a heart attack, say, or to recover fully if we have a stroke. And that's great, that's good. That's what I want for my family, for myself, for all of the families and individuals listening to this. I want them to be happier and healthier. But it has meant centralisation. And that's why we've ended up in Buckinghamshire with an A&E department at Aylesbury that doesn't have a heart and stroke unit, with a heart and stroke unit here with an urgent treatment centre. So that does mean that some of the more complex surgery, for example, like trauma, isn't dealt with in Buckinghamshire at all. It's in Oxfordshire, in Oxford. And unfortunately it's all a bit complicated, but in the end it boils down to this. If you think you're dying, dial 999 and let the ambulance service do the right stuff, partly because the ambulances can now deliver a great deal of life-saving care in the ambulance. And if it's less urgent, please dial 111. And if you wish to go to the urgent treatment centre and just walk in, you can. But we need to let dialing 999 and dialing 111 take care of where we're routed. But if I may, on that point, you asked about Matt Hancock. The reason Matt Hancock came is because the party announced we were going to build 40 new hospitals, and I looked at it, and my immediate reaction in a WhatsApp group was, that's no good to me unless we're having one in Wycombe, as you'd expect. So I chatted with Matt privately. I then asked a parliamentary question, would he come and visit Wycombe to discuss our need for investment? And yesterday he happened to be travelling through, so he popped in. We discussed two things at the hospital yesterday, two areas of investment. One is the estate, like literally the buildings and land that we have. My vision there would be, and I need to work, if I'm re-elected, this is what I'll do. I'll work with the police, with the fire service, with the ambulances, with the NHS, because what I want to see is a blue light hub. We've ended up with old, tired buildings. We've got the Office World site there. We've got a fire station which is old and perhaps too big. We've got a police station which doesn't have enough parking for cars. The ambulance station's tired. You can see where I'm going with this, right? So wouldn't it be wonderful if instead of coming in and seeing a hospital and people feeling that there's some decay going on when actually outcomes are improving, if there was a blue light hub there? So that's what I'd like to see, but obviously it's not for me to direct. I need to persuade the people who actually manage the estate. So we discussed that a little. The other issue, which is really exciting, Buckinghamshire's appointed a lady who is working on behalf of the new Unitary Council and the NHS and social care to do a really transformational digital project. So one of the things I learned yesterday is at the moment the IT is so old that a doctor can spend 20 minutes signing in several times a day. What a complete waste. So how much better it will be if this incredible digital project is allowed to go ahead, which she seems to have every reason to be confident can be done. I mean, they seem to be using agile methods. I've got so much more to learn about it. I had an hour yesterday going through some of it. But she made a pitch to the Secretary of State for the investment necessary in Buckinghamshire to make sure that the public, through their smartphones, will have a single portal to all the services that the County Council and the NHS and social care can offer. So, for example, suppose you use a service because you've got one particular medical problem. Just like Amazon says, why don't you buy the DVD if you buy the book? The app will say, well, if you're using that service, you might also like to consider this other service. If a person has a range of appointments booked but then goes into hospital, then their outpatient appointments will automatically be cancelled because they're in hospital and so forth. This is the vision of where we should be going. Now, people are always sceptical about IT projects, and that's why, though, we're not doing a massive national project. It's a county-level project. But real leadership is happening in Buckinghamshire. And I'm just really excited that we might find that our county, our town, is at the forefront of a really dramatic transformation, driving up the quality of care, driving up the availability of resources, dramatically improving the working environment for staff in the NHS and in our public services, as well as giving the public the kind of access to public services that they've come to expect in the private sector. So that's what we were discussing, and that's where I'd like us to be going. But what I don't want us to be doing is making false promises to the public about getting A&E back when it isn't possible. And it would be positively undesirable to go back to the A&E of the 70s and 80s, and it isn't possible to close Stoke Mandeville's A&E and bring it to Wycombe. And therefore, an urgent treatment centre with a heart and a stroke unit and a dramatic transformation of how we access services through digital, that's the right thing to do because it's best for local people. So that's the reason I'm vocal about it. I'm passionate about an honest politics which doesn't say to people, I'll get A&E back, because it can't be done, and I've checked that with everyone I could possibly think of.
What can we do to address the rise in the use of food banks and also the homeless problem in Wycombe?
So it's an issue that goes to the heart of who we are. And I've been a homeless connection volunteer since it started through Speen Baptist Church before I was a candidate. People who are homeless are often very difficult to help because they'll have complex interrelated problems like addictions and mental health issues. We're going to be spending more money on mental health, and in our manifesto we commit to ending rough sleeping by the end of the Parliament. So I was very proud to vote for the Homelessness Reduction Act, which has put additional duties on councils, and as a result there are additional beds available in Wycombe this winter. And we've also committed through things like Housing First to end rough sleeping. It's going to be difficult to do, though, because tenancies do end, families do break down, people do get addicted, their lives do fall apart. But it's always seemed to me throughout successive governments that it was a crass failure of the welfare state that anyone ended up homeless. And I've always felt it was heartbreaking. That's why I'm a long-term homeless connection volunteer, although I've tended not to talk about it except when I've been fundraising. So on food banks, whenever food banks come up, it's very, very painful that anyone should have to go to a food bank. And it's very painful that food bank use increased last year. And my first question was, is this related to universal credit? And the answer is no, because universal credit was rolled out in Wycombe after food bank use started to rise. So I don't think I'm sure it's not universal credit. That said, we do need to put more money into universal credit, and we have been doing that. But what we need to do is just drive down the cost of living. That means doing things like making more affordable housing available, and that's why I've been involved with projects like 2011, which I'm incredibly proud of here, which is making more affordable rents available to people. And we need to get alongside projects like that so that people in work don't suffer these moments of crisis, because that seems to be what happens with food bank use. Most people using the food bank have a moment of financial crisis, haven't got sufficient resilience in savings, and so they end up that they need the food bank, and they have a number of parcels, and then they go back to life probably struggling to make ends meet. Well, surely if we're in politics for anything, it's driving up prosperity and lifting people out of that place of struggle. So the Conservative manifesto has a wide range of policies on the cost of living, on narrowing inequalities, on housing, and I want to be right across all of those things so that we're lifting the poor out of poverty. Because in the end, I want there to be no one in poverty. I want everybody to be affluent. And I think the best way to do that is a market economy with the appropriate interventions from the state, which is where we are as a Conservative Party.
What did you think about the recent protest by the group Extinction Rebellion?
So they've got a legitimate concern. And as I've said several times, the notable thing about this election is we're all environmentalists now, and we really are. I mean, the Conservative Party's committed us to net zero by 2050 on carbon emissions, and there's a range of other policies in the manifesto. But it's the wrong thing to do to try and shut down a capital city to get your way. It's just inconsiderate to other people. There's a very good policy exchange paper has been written about Extinction Rebellion and their tactics and the things they do deliberately, and in particular getting people arrested. Well, I would just caution anyone thinking of getting involved with Extinction Rebellion. You don't want arrests on your record. It will harm the rest of your life, potentially. I mean, I've seen people who've had various cautions and so forth who find that they then can't get the job they wanted because they've been arrested or cautioned or whatever. So it's not responsible politics, and it's not responsible protesting to be shutting down a capital city and having a deliberate policy of encouraging people to get arrested and have to go to court in order to gum up the court system. Because we've got serious crimes need to be dealt with and real people getting hurt by serious criminals. And what I don't want to see is our courts gummed up with Extinction Rebellion protesters who've got themselves arrested deliberately in order to gum the system up. It's wrong. And actually it's not. I think that Extinction Rebellion was not well received by, for example, East End commuters in some footage that we all saw. So it's a very serious issue. It shouldn't be dealt with by shutting down capital cities and inconveniencing millions of people, especially when they're already winning the argument. There's a debate to be had about when we get to net zero. The Conservative Party, advised by experts, the Independent Committee on Climate Change, has gone for 2050. I was handed a paper by one of my opponents yesterday on going for an earlier date, which I read this morning. It's certainly interested in having a conversation. But what I'm not willing to do is shut down our freedom, shut down the market economy, and dramatically increase poverty over this issue. We need to deal sensibly with climate change, and that's what the Conservative Party will do.
Taking you back into Westminster for a moment, how do you feel about the Fixed Terms Parliament Act?
It's got to go, and it's in our manifesto that it's got to go. It was one of the areas where I loyally voted for it without rebelling, and Jacob Rees-Mogg rebelled on it, and then later on it all shifted round. But he forecast at the time that it was a terrible idea, and he's proven to be right. Having a supermajority to get to an election allowed the Labour Party and other opponents to hold the government hostage, unable to act. And thank goodness, finally, we've got to a general election, because however difficult this election is, it's better than grinding miserably on in minority, unable to govern the country. But the Fixed Term Parliament Act's got to go.
You've done it now for 9 years. What do you consider the role of an MP to be?
Well, the first thing I'd say about that, the role of the MP is to serve the whole public however they voted, and that's what I've always sought to do. There's about 7 ways that an MP should do it. First thing, of course, the most obvious thing is we're legislators, so you make, amend, improve and stop the making of laws. Secondly, to examine the daily workings of the executive, so standing up and asking about policy, putting in written questions. holding the government to account, that is. Thirdly, to represent the interests of constituents in Westminster. So, Jessica Monk's parents came to me, and I can name them because they wanted it done in public. Jessica Monk's parents came to me after she died, and I stood up and represented them very directly in a debate on epilepsy and care for people with various difficult issues. To support our party or colleagues in a collective effort to govern or oppose, so actually getting behind ministers and supporting them, or indeed serving as a minister. Advancing causes, national or local, so our hospital and healthcare. To liaise or scrutinise the European Union and devolved administrations. To that I'd add things like the Council of Europe, which isn't in the EU, it's a separate institution. NATO, there's a parliamentary assembly in NATO, and of course scrutinising things like free trade agreements and how they function. So, and then finally to carry out casework. And one of the things I've done as MP is dramatically increase the capacity to help people with casework in Wycombe. So I inherited having half a person in Wycombe, as it were, a person working half-time in Wycombe. I've increased that to one person working full-time and one person who works 4 days out of 5. And I'm incredibly proud of their work helping people. They help almost 1,000 people. It's been 1,000 people some years, but it's more like 700-800 people a year, or at least cases a year. But hundreds and hundreds of people every year with benefits issues, housing issues, immigration, tax, every conceivable issue. But what I have to say, though, the job of the MP is not to overturn the decisions of properly constituted bodies, including the courts. People sometimes think we're an alternative to the courts, and we're not. One of the principles of our system is the separation of powers. So we can't overturn a court decision. We can't get people off their parking tickets. We can't tell the council they got it wrong. We can certainly make a case to the council and ask them to take factors into account, but we can't overthrow their decisions. I don't run either council. So the MP is first and foremost a legislator, but being a legislator and being able to stand up in Parliament, ask questions, does mean that all public bodies will answer a letter and listen. And it's been a privilege to help people by using that influence.
Final question, which I'm going to ask to you in a slightly different way that I asked to everyone else. As the MP, do you have a second home near Westminster, or do you commute in and out every day from Wycombe?
I commute every day, except when I can't. So, I live in West Wycombe, and I usually commute on my motorcycle, frankly, because it's cheaper and I like riding my motorcycle. And otherwise, I use the train, and I'm quite often seen on the train and have a chat with constituents on the train or the train station. But I don't have a second home. No, I have been lodging in Wycombe. I started lodging because it just became impossible to come home when I was a minister. And if you're voting at 10 p.m. through till 10:30, 11, you just can't come back. So I will normally commute, and when I can't commute, I'll stay.
You don't want to have that mad dash back to Marylebone trying to catch that 10 past midnight train?
Well, I'm well aware that there are plenty of people in Wycombe who commute and work enormous hours, and I will, out of respect for them, I will commute and do long hours and commute. But Parliament does sometimes sit until 2 or 3 in the morning on a finance bill, and I therefore can't pledge to always commute. I will normally commute, and I don't have a second home.
That's Steve Baker, who is standing as the Conservative candidate in Wycombe at the general election on Thursday, December the 12th. And you can hear that along with all of my other interviews with the candidates standing in both Wycombe and in Beaconsfield, as well as the 2 roundtable discussion programmes that we carried out with the candidates on our website. The address is wycombesound.org.uk. Coming up next, we'll hear from the Green Party candidate, who is Peter Sims.